Hi, everyone. I wanted to talk about a specific subject today because it's kind of close to me, and it's something that I deal with all the time in my business and when producing these YouTube videos, and that's OCD, the subject of OCD. So when I'm doing walkthroughs of houses for my regular cleaning business, a lot of the time during the walkthrough, I often hear things like, my house used to never be like this. I used to be so OCD about keeping it clean. And I'll hear variations of that over and over and over again. And though super cleanliness is one form of OCD or one manifestation of OCD, I think that TV shows and movies have kind of warped our perception of what OCD actually is, because it's not about cleanliness and having things in their exact order. Let me explain to you what OCD is in the mind of someone who has OCD. So I grew up with a mild form of OCD and a mild form of Tourette's. My brother grew up with it as well, and he still carries a lot of the bulk of his OCD, but not quite as much of the Tourette's. For those who don't know it, there is a form of Tourette's that it's common that people grow out of it by a certain age. Severe Tourette's, you don't. It's just there forever. But like the type of hand-in-hand neurodivergence that we had growing up were mild forms that over time you can kind of train your mind out of. It took me about 40 years to do that. But let me give you a peek inside my brain back then. And this is going to sound absolutely crazy, but that's kind of the whole thing with OCD is it's not logical, right? So in my brain at about the age of 4, I had designated 2 words to be good and bad. Those words were please meant good and no meant bad. I had also associated a direction with good and bad. So up and right were both good directions. Down and left were both bad directions. And so if I looked at a clock, there were varying degrees of good versus evil depending on where the hands were. I had also assigned a sort of good and evil quality to certain numbers. And if I thought those numbers in my head, I had to do sort of a little mental gymnastics to kind of cleanse my mind of having been tainted by that number. So part of the ritual would be to say good and bad things in my head over and over and over again until that number was cleansed. So I've already established that I had a please, no, good and bad baseline that I had stuck in my head. So if I had to cleanse my brain of anything that I thought was bad or evil, I would say the words please, no, please, no, please, no over and over and over in my head until it kind of like scratched an itch and I felt clean again. I did the please no thing until I was in my probably late 20s or early 30s, and I still catch myself doing it. OCD is not just about keeping things in order. And in fact, a lot of OCD cases, you won't find their houses in any different condition than anyone else that you know. It's about the rituals, and it's about applying an obsessive thought and a compulsive action to things that most people would not even consider to be an issue. So again, directions with good and evil, numbers associated with good and evil. If I say the number 6 in my head, it may mean that that's going to cause something bad somewhere down the line unless I cleanse it. At one point, I thought that if I drove the direction south, it would offend God. That's how bad it gets in your head. Now, over time, I was able to recognize how illogical some of these things were, and I would force my brain to not do that. If I thought of a number 6, which I thought was an evil number back in whenever I was younger, I would force myself to not do the please no thing. I would force myself to not cleanse, and it felt like torture. It felt like the world was going to end and I was the cause of it. That's what OCD is. They're not cleaning their house because they have to have a spotless house. The people who have that form of OCD are doing it because if their house is not clean, it feels like they are going to cause something catastrophic. The illogical nature of that is what makes that a disorder rather than just a quirk. So the Tourette's was something that was kind of bizarre because I didn't know that was a thing that some people do grow out of. But my brother and I both had tics. We had to squeeze our eyes and clench our eyes. We would make these throat clicks, which I'll see if this shows up on the microphone. But many, many times a day, we had to do a certain number of clicks that sounded like And for many, many, many years, I could not stop myself from doing that. But once I hit a certain level of maturity, I could concentrate on it when I felt the urge coming to do it, and I could force myself to not do it. It took so long to stop. Now my brother has got a thing where I can't remember what his number is, it may be 8, but if you touch, let's say his number's 8, and if you touch him 7 times and then stop, he will flip out. He will physically grab your hand and force you to touch him one more time. He still has a lot of those OCD tendencies, and he's aware of it. It's so difficult to handle because most people never get past that. So why am I talking about OCD? There are 2 reasons. One is what I've already mentioned, which is I encounter it a lot, and people often misattribute what OCD actually means to just a general idea of keeping your house in order or whatever. But for the longest time, psychologists believed that OCD and hoarding disorder were cousins of each other, that they were basically the same thing. And it makes sense from a logical point of view because OCD is an illogical compulsion to act a certain way or to carry out a certain action and an obsession with that compulsion. So you have to do it. Hoarding is the excessive saving of items, whether they be good or bad, even if the items are garbage. It's why a lot of people look at some of these super messy houses with like maggots and stuff in them and say that's not hoarding, that's just not being clean. No, it's hoarding. So that's what the hoarding turned into, was it had the side effect of producing a ton of maggots, and the garbage is purposely kept. They cannot throw things away. That seems to go hand in hand with OCD. However, what they found was that when they hooked up people's big old head brains to the big machine doctor monitors, I think that's what they're called, the images that they got back, the activity centers of the brain were different in OCD versus hoarding disorder. And what they found was that hoarding disorder was its own entity. It turns out that there are 2 places in the brain toward the front of the brain that light up in most everyone, including people with OCD. And those areas are associated with decision making and emotional control. So whenever you watch a show like Hoarders and you see people flipping out and their fight or flight mode kicks in, that's the emotional control portion of the brain. It turns out that those 2 areas of the brain under monitoring either don't light up at all or are extremely diminished. So obviously the decision part, we can understand that right away because they have a lack of ability to make decisions, to throw things away or to clean. But the emotional control part was really kind of surprising. That's not really an issue with OCD. However, ironically, there are parts of OCD that can lead to either hoarding or just extremely messy houses because it becomes a part of their compulsion. It's really fascinating, and it's worth looking up and researching, finding videos on it, finding research papers. The only problem with this issue is that you have to get current information because the findings that hoarding disorder is its own entity that's not really directly related to OCD, that's a really, really recent finding. So it's easy to find outdated information that still refers to hoarding as a form of OCD. But yeah, the idea of OCD being used as a descriptor or an adjective for cleanliness is really misunderstanding what that mental disorder is. But anyway, I thought it was an important subject to talk about because I think it's really hard for the average person to have any sort of empathy for the people who are living in these hoarding situations. And I think that once you have an actual understanding, no matter how minor, of how things like this are literally and physically out of their control, that understanding helps you to empathize. Knowing that the person understands that their actions are illogical and that they still can't stop it. And I think if anything is taken away from my channel beyond just the entertainment of watching the chaos turn into order, I want people to understand why these people live the way that they live. And I want them to understand that hoarding disorder is its own separate mental illness from OCD. And I want them to understand the terminology that they use whenever they make statements like, I'm so OCD about fill in the blank. Because I think that whenever you have an understanding of that, empathy naturally comes. But anyway, I'm going to be doing a house this Saturday, and we're going to be spending multiple days there. But a guy had inherited a hoarder house from his parents. It is the cleanest hoarder house I've ever seen, but it is absolutely jam-packed with stuff, especially in the closets, and he is hopeless until he contacted us. He had lost all hope that he would ever live in a normal house again that he was proud to exist in. And so this guy is super sweet. He is totally, completely awesome, and I can't wait to get started on that house. I hope everybody has a great week, and I will see you on Saturday.